I came from a working class black community uptown in Pigeontown, right? And so the reality is my entire life, the word Angola has always been something in my subconscious because from as long as I can remember, there was always somebody in my community and my family that was in Angola, right? And one of the things I tell little brothers when I talk to them now is that when you do something, whatever it is, that allow yourself to be put into this legal system, the only thing you really do is because of the exception that's in the 13th Amendment, the only thing you do is give people the legal framework to make you a slave in 2024. That's all it is. And it happens every day. And so when Brother Herman Wallace passed away, who was a member of the Angola Three, I was honored to be asked to read a poem at his repast. And I thought it would be appropriate for me to read the poem that I wrote about Brother Herman Wallace and had the honor and privilege of reading at his repast at the Treme Center. The plantation turned penitentiary is still a plantation. 300 years of rich Louisiana topsoil, watered from the sweat of free labor. Tell Warden Kane that Herman Wallace, Robert King, and Albert Wood Fox have exposed Angola's wretched plan for profiteering by turning men into animals. The gig is up, the curtains have been pulled back. The interrogation light is shining in the face of Boss Hog Kane and the rest of his prison administration. The entire world sees the rotten plantation politics and his fraudulent laws, framing leaders who work to end lawlessness. Your farm is a moneymaker. You say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Keep the slaves slaves and make examples of anyone who reminds them they're men. Boyles Kane, you can send our trifecta of heroes to solitary confinement for 110 collective years, but you can't silence them. Their voice is a ferment of insurrection, a gift from the ancestors that can't be turned down or off. The eternal flames, their eternal flames will forever speak out against the injustices and inhumanity of your working plantation. They have exposed your antiquated 21st century free labor mill. The memory of Herman Wallace is an unshakable call to burn down the farm. His voice is an eternal cry for justice after 41 years of solitary confinement. His ability to still laugh was an unrelenting sign of his humanity. He be the Black Panther, rebel rouser, and audacious reminder of truth and fairness. His soul will rest in the pantheon of African martyrs. Somebody please tell West Feliciana District Attorney Samuel D. Aquila they can lock him up, but they can't hold him down. The spirit of Herman Wallace is unchainable.
Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's conversation. We'll be talking about PJI's documentary that we just watched on plantation prisons, and we'll also discuss other practices of forced prison labor, legal and non-legal advocacy to abolish these practices, as well as anti-Black and environmental racism in the South. My name is Maya Fino. I am a cultural worker and political educator based in Brooklyn, New York, from Durham, North Carolina. I'm at the Center for Constitutional Rights as the Political Education and Research Manager, and I'll be moderating our discussion tonight. First off, I want to thank all the speakers for taking the time to join us. I really look forward to learning from each of you. And also, please note, we're going to have a Q&A after the panel. And with that, I'm going to introduce each of our panelists. I'll start with Terrence Wynn. Terrence is a Shreveport, Louisiana resident and prison reform advocate. At the age of 16, Terrence was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole and ultimately served 30 years of imprisonment. Terrence was incarcerated at Angola, and during his imprisonment, he endured at least 6 stints in solitary confinement, including one that lasted 13 months. Terrence obtained a GED diploma and culinary degree while incarcerated. Following his release from Angola in 2020, he has advocated for prison reform. Terrence is the executive director and founder of the Louisiana nonprofit Priorities, Intentions, Practical Exchanges, which advocates for criminal justice reform, connects incarcerated people with legal assistance, and assists formerly incarcerated individuals with re-entry. Terrence is currently working with Angola's 10-2 committee in their struggle to find justice for people incarcerated with unconstitutional Jim Crow jury convictions. I'll now move to Deidre Thomas. Deidre is proud to work at PJI as a formerly incarcerated woman. During her time at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women, Deidre became a self-taught counsel sub/jailhouse lawyer, giving 25 and a half years of service. Deidre, along with other women serving life sentences who served as her role models, sought to understand and challenge incarcerated women's convictions, sentences, and conditions of confinement. Through that process, she obtained her bachelor's degree from the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary with minors in biblical and women's ministry. Deidre is currently pursuing an additional degree in social science from Newcomb College at Tulane University. Next, we have Ronald Marshall. Ronald is the Chief Policy Analyst at Voice of the Experience, VOTE. His primary focus is on policy initiatives that directly impact currently and formerly incarcerated individuals. With 25 years of personal experience with injustice, Ronald is determined to be a game changer in how the system conducts its business. While in the Louisiana Department of Corrections, Ronald earned a paralegal degree from Blackstone's School of Law and became a counsel sub. After his release, he took his thirst for knowledge to Tulane University, where he's currently working towards a master's degree in digital marketing and media communication. Ronald owns a mental health LLC that contracts with local jails and state prisons to teach trauma-informed perspectives to incarcerated people. In 2023, Ronald drafted HB 55, the Mental Healing Justice Act for Incarcerated People, which was signed into law as Act 214 of the 2023 regular legislative session. Amazing. And finally, we have Emily Early. Emily is the Associate Director of the Southern Regional Office of the Center for Constitutional Rights. Her primary responsibilities include leading the expansion of the Southern Regional Office's engagement in movement litigation and advocacy, and development of its local capacity to challenge systemic imbalances of power in partnership with allies and partners throughout the South. Prior to joining the Center for Constitutional Rights, Emily served as a senior supervising attorney with the Economic Justice Project of the Southern Poverty Law Center, where she practiced for nearly 6 years. Emily is a proud graduate of Howard University School of Law, and she graduated from Spelman College with a BA degree in sociology and a minor in Spanish. So excited to chat with you all. I have some questions that are specific to each individual, but first I want to start with something general. So we just finished watching the PJI film, Plantations and Prisons. In addition to your initial reactions, what are your thoughts on prisons being built on top of or in proximity to sites of harm? So whether that be chattel slavery plantations, or the fact that prisons can be near former toxic industrial plants or wastelands as well.
You asked what were our thoughts on it? I think my thoughts are, it keeps with traditions. Africans were brought over here on ships, bound in chains. Like 6 million of us didn't make it. We jumped off the ships. So everything has been off for us since we come here. And slavery was just a part of that, the hardship. And prison keeps the traditions of slavery going. So it's not to better the conditions of black people in this country. It's to keep us knowing our place, so to speak. So when you put prisons around harmful chemicals and everything, it's saying we discovered Earth already. So why not let us accept that harm, because we've caused harm. That's how they see it. So let us be the guinea pigs, the live guinea pigs, to accept that. And if anything happens, it doesn't matter, because we're no longer part of society anyway.
The idea that prisons are erected on toxic grounds is, from its very inception, lets me know that the Constitution nor the moneymakers in this situation intended to present constitutional conditions for an incarcerated male or female. The sad thing about it is that many women and men have died as a result of these circumstances, and the process continues to go on. Instead of building more prisons, why not try to rehabilitate people and do more on the home front?
Yeah, when I think about prisons being built on top of the same grounds that house enslaved black people, I think about the three key ingredients that survived slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and mass incarceration. And those ingredients are exploitation by any means necessary, racial discrimination by any means necessary, and economic gain by any means necessary. It doesn't matter whether or not an incarcerated person is being housed in a village around toxic chemicals or on a plantation that houses toxic chemicals. It's by any means necessary.
Yeah, thank you all for your answers. I really appreciated how you're talking about just like the disposability and the tradition, how these toxic sites continue the tradition of the ways in which enslaved Africans have been treated in this country since before its inception. I think there's also something about how it's also a reflection of the way that like Black folks, poor folks have always been treated as subhuman non-citizens in this country. I'd like to move to a question directly for Terrence. So your organization, Priorities, Intentions, Practical Exchanges, engages in wide-reaching prison and criminal legal system reform work. So I'm wondering if you can tell us more about the scope of your work, especially how it relates to ending forced labor.
The scope of it is to see guys, the initial scope is to see kids not take the step into a prison, whether it's a juvenile facility or an adult facility. Well, I was a juvenile that was tried as an adult, and I did 30 years of my life in prison. So the scope is not to let kids do that. It is also to help those who have turned the leaf in their life, who have really rehabilitated themselves and can be a positive impact and force in society. So we try to help all of those guys. By partnering with PJI and Vote, we aim to just do whatever we can to make conditions better. Because while we was incarcerated, no one was doing it. So all of us sat in prison and we all thought of different ways to make things better. We all spoke on things because we endured. We endured something that many of y'all don't, many of y'all maybe can't fathom. And so while we was going through those horrendous conditions, we would always have these dreams of, man, if somebody was doing this here, man, this here happen. Or man, when I get out, I'm gonna do this here and I'm gonna do that. Many people haven't done that, but guys like Ronald, Norris, and others, we've gotten out and really put our feet on the ground to really dig in, to fight, to help guys have better conditions in prison. And thus for, their work is paying off. So people got a lot to thank us for.
Thank you so much for your work. I have a question for Deirdre and Ronald. So PJI filed a lawsuit on behalf of Vote and several other plaintiffs, Vote versus LeBlanc, challenging the unconstitutional conditions of forced farm labor at Angola. Can you both speak about this litigation and how it came to fruition?
You waiting on me, I did. I got
Men first.
So, talking about the farm line litigation, it's long overdue. As often as I think about my own experiences and guys going to the farm, the fields, passing out, coming in the dormitory without any energy to go get second job because the sun had drained the life out of them. They would just lay down on the floor and get some sleep. Angola, in every prison that places men in the field to work is extracting that labor. When the farmland litigation first happened, I thought about the counter argument that DOC made. And their position is that the forced labor practices does not turn a profit for the state of Louisiana. And I thought about that. And I said to myself, that's a lie. If you think about one man who works 40 hours a day, and if he was being paid market wage of $7.25 an hour, that's 2,000 hours a year, times 1,000 men. That's almost $14 million that's saving the state of not hiring somebody to do the work that currently incarcerated people doing. There are 27,000 people incarcerated in Louisiana. I'm going to say give or take 15,000 of those men are doing some form of forced labor practices in DOC. That number comes to $217 million a year if the Department of Corrections was to pay them $7 an hour. And some of these jobs require more pay than $7 an hour. Some of them require pay $20 an hour. Some of the work that these guys do, if they was paying market rates, probably going to the 30s and the 40s. The Department of Corrections in the state of Louisiana is saving almost $1 billion a year by forcing men and women in DOC to work. So how this lawsuit came about? We're tired. Our brothers and sisters are tired. They're tired of waking up every day, year in and year out, being told to work. Otherwise, go to the dungeons. They're tired. And like I said, this lawsuit is long overdue. It should have happened early on, but we wasn't in that time. We're in a different time today. We're surrounded by advocates and activists and lawyers all over this country. And that's the beauty about the work. We are rising to meet the need of mass incarceration, slavery, Jim Crow. We're rising to meet that need every single day. And I wake up every day to do this work. So to answer your question, what brought about the farmland lawsuit? The cries of the inside. Just like that vote, we don't file any policies unless we get the input from those people on the inside. We have an inside-outside approach. The same thing with PJI. PJI has an inside-outside approach. They take the complaints of those on the inside, and if there's some merit to those claims, guess what? PJI act on it. And that brought about that lawsuit. People are being forced to work without being paid for that labor. The United States, there's so many laws in effect. The Fair Wages Act, the Penis Act, the Human Trafficking Act. All these laws prohibit you from forcing someone to work without wages. You have to pay people. That's illegal. That's illegal. So what brought about the lawsuit? Just complaints, cries, screams, yells, pain, suffering. You know?
And the uniqueness of Vote and Promise for Justice coming together is that someone spoke that was directly impacted by incarceration and the conditions. Someone listened and someone acted. If it wasn't for voices of the experience erecting Vote on the inside of Angola and those individuals eventually being released, they thought about the families and communities and the people that they cared near and dear about, people that they slept on the side of for 20, 30, sometimes 40 and 50 years. They reached back because they showed what community really is. In that process, families and communities listened to their families. They listened to their loved ones that suffered under the conditions of incarceration. And people like PJI reacted and acted. In totality, everybody came together for this monumental event and to name the justice system for just what it is: cruel and unusual punishment. These men, women are forced, like Ronald said, to work. If they choose not to work, they go to a dungeon that's even hotter than the fields that they slaved in. Knowing the history of being oppressed, depressed, and suppressed, many decided to rise above the circumstances and present to the world, this is what we are allowing. Let's stop the cycle. Let's stop the cycle of our children, our great-grandchildren. Let's stop the history of slavery being renamed as something else under the guise of the Department of Corrections or an unjust justice system. More so, let's give our people, let's give us a name that we want to be acknowledged by. We are loved. We are adored by families. We deserve to be heard. If you have a voice, speak. If you have a voice, help. It is in communities just like this that people come together for change. It is people like the Center of Constitutional Rights that bestow multitudes of information to incarcerated individuals that help in this process. We must not lose hope. We must continue to have faith and press forward. More importantly, I'm getting ready to end. More importantly than anything, let's give dignity back to the individuals. Even though they committed a wrong, there's some right that we can still do in spite of popular opinions or what the money makers say. It's time for so many people to be released and actually know what true liberty and freedom is.
Thank you both for your answers. They were brilliant. And I really love how you both emphasized that the litigation and the advocacy is rising to the call and demand of directly impacted people who understand what it's like to be forced to work without pay. And I really appreciate that. Deidre, I have one more question for you directly, and then we'll move into a question generally. So often discussions about the injustice and terror of the criminal legal system, incarceration, and forced labor in the US center primarily on violence against Black men and boys. So I'm wondering if you can please speak to some of the experiences of forced labor that are unique to incarcerated Black women and girls and the conditions of confinement in women's prisons.
Oh, that's a hardy question. As an incarcerated Black female serving right at 26 years of incarceration, I had the opportunity to give birth to a beautiful son. If it wasn't for my family, I would not know my son. It wasn't until recently that I had the opportunity to speak on women's incarceration. And in the process, I learned more through people like Ronald and Terrence of the conditions of the men. And when I started looking at the conditions of the women, I was questioning, well, where are the advocates? Where are the issues about incarcerated women? Once you take away the strong African-American men, once you take away the men from the mothers, the children, what do you expect to happen to the mothers and the children? Women slave just as hard as men. Women, Black, white, majority Black that succumb to incarceration, deal with a lot of emotional trauma. We have to start looking at a gendered eye, looking at women for who women are, looking at women for the trials, the tribulations, and the traumas that we've gone through. We cannot ignore what women also go through. Don't let it, we have to understand that we can't allow it to become a Black history thing to just say, okay, this has gone on with women and act as if it's not an issue. We have to acknowledge places that have been erected to assist women that shed a light on the health conditions of incarcerated women, the experimental procedures that are going on inside the prison systems with doctors that do not have adequate credentials to do the job that they're doing. What about the women? That is an excellent question. Can you repeat it one more time?
I absolutely can.
Because I get to going.
I'll repeat the whole thing. So often discussions about the injustice and terror of the criminal legal system, incarceration, and forced labor in the US center primarily on violence against Black men and boys. So can you please speak to some of the experiences of forced labor that are unique to incarcerated Black women and girls and the conditions of confinement in women's prisons?
Let's just say, in light of what we saw in the movie, of incarcerated men laboring in the fields. Imagine a woman that has been stripped from her child, stripped from her family, forced to address the abuses that she suffered, and sits in a prison cell because she cried or she was emotional at some point in time and is sent to the dungeon as a form of mental health. That should not be. Prison systems are designed to do just what they're doing, oppress. Prison systems are designed to do just what they're doing, separating friends from families. But one thing I do know is that the prison system cannot remain the same. We must come together as a people and address this as a whole. We must come together as a people and call it for what it is. You're dehumanizing people and trying to legitimize the reasons that you're doing it. Wrong is wrong. Call it for what it is.
First, I just want to say it's such an honor to be on this panel. I'm sitting here learning from all of you all, and so I'm soaking it all up, and I'm just so honored to sit here and listen to y'all's expertise and experiences. So thank you for allowing me to be on this panel with you all. One piece I wanted to add to Ms. Deidre's response to Maya's question about the unique experiences of incarcerated women is in a lawsuit that Center for Constitutional Rights brought on behalf of 6 incarcerated workers, individuals in the Alabama Department of Corrections, also challenging forced labor or slavery and voluntary servitude in prison systems in Alabama, is that we were very intentional in centering the story of our one woman identifying plaintiff, Trafika Stanley. She is the only woman identified of our 6 plaintiffs. The remainder are Black men. And we intentionally, for the reasons Maya highlighted in their answer and for the reasons Ms. Deidre highlighted in Maya's question and also in Ms. Deidre's answer, we wanted to put her first in what's called the case caption of our complaint, because the stories of incarcerated women, or just women in general, Black women in general, and their intersectional experiences are often subordinated or not the center of these stories of justice oftentimes that we are telling. And so we wanted to make sure that people understood Ms. Trevika's particular plight and how important it is to have these intersectional approaches when we're looking at, not just race, but also gender and class and sexuality and how that impacts the unique experiences of folks who are on the inside. And so it's so important to highlight stories like yours, Ms. Deidre, and also that of Ms. Trevika, who is one of our plaintiffs in our lawsuit, which I'll talk a bit more about later on, but wanted to just underscore that we have to be intentional about, highlighting the experiences of Black men, but also Black women and trans men and other people who are at the margins of society. And it's something we try to do in our advocacy at CCR and also at PJI.
Thank you so much, Deidre and Emily, for your brilliance. Really appreciated your answer to that question and the need for having a gendered lens, and also, like you said, Emily, class, sexuality, so on and so forth, also need to be looked at. So this is a question that anyone on the panel can answer. So we know that forced labor in facilities like Angola, also the Alabama Department of Corrections, and other prisons across the South, like all of that is just one manifestation of slavery that still exists across this nation. So what are other incidents of slavery? What other incidents of slavery exist in today's world, in addition to forced labor in prisons?
Say it again. You want to know what other incidents of forced labor exist in society and not in prison?
Outside.
Oh, wow. Mm.
You said what other incidents of forced labor or just slavery? Not both. People not believing in the system that sets precedence over your life. And so when you're speaking of that, you're speaking of it really into the Black community, because we have to fight to get the right to vote. And when you hear Ms. Andrea speaking about the 1888 convention, a lot of that had to do with us having the right to vote and us becoming citizens and being on jury pools. So they wanted to rid us of that. So, you know, if anybody realized and understand the 13th Amendment was a compromise, because when has the loser ever decided what the winner can do? So the North won the war, and they compromised with the South to keep slavery going. The war was about slavery. So we kept slavery through prison. So if a person commit a crime, you go to prison and you still a slave. So we got the black codes came about. And the black codes came about that made more black people go to prison. So slavery, to answer, to keep with the question so that y'all can really catch what I'm saying is, we was never written into the Constitution, even to this day. Because when it comes to 3/5 of a man clause, that was never remedied. That was never addressed in the Constitution. What it did was, they just added amendments. 13th, 14th, and the 14th Amendment makes us be able to do what white Americans can do. That gives us the right to vote and everything. But nothing was ever said to say that we are humans. So slavery continues within the black community because we willingly gives up a right to vote. And that's the only thing really makes you American, your right to vote. That's your freedom. Anything else is nothing. So if I convict you of a crime, I take your right from you. A lot of people would look at your gun rights. You lose that also, because that makes you an American also. Because had John Adams now never come up with the idea to do the Boston Tea Party, America would have never gained its independence. But what makes you really a citizen of this country is when you can go to the polls. And with the black community, what we do is, and this is what keeps us slaves. Like our lawmakers, they would say, that the grandfather clause came about, where a white person probably couldn't read and write. They was making it hard for black people. Well, we got to stop them from being able to vote. They can't read and write. So they said, what about the white people that can't read and write? Well, if his grandfather could read and write, he could vote. That never existed with us. So white people by proxy could still vote, even if they couldn't read and write. But we couldn't. But we had people like the great Martin Luther King and other advocates fought for us to have the right to vote, but we still give it up. And it's like, even if the highest bidder comes, we won't vote. We got a governor that just won the election with the lowest voter turnout in the history of Louisiana. And Republicans understand the fact that if we get a low black voter turnout, they automatically win the race. And black people in the slave mentality won't vote. Look at our presidential election. Nobody in here that's white has ever had to stand up and say, I'm white. Or we got Kamala Harris running for president. Black people saying she's not black because Donald Trump told them that she's never been black until it benefited her. I mean, if y'all had it rough like we had, we probably would do the same thing. But as a black person, I've never had to stand up and tell nobody that I'm black. They look at me and say, I'm finna treat you like you black. But I've never had to stand up and say it. But when you look at the question, we as black people give up our vote, and it stays with the slave mentality that was installed in us. So we become slaves because we won't participate in the true form of democracy.
And
When we go first, we go.
So as I appreciate the question, where are other practices of forced labor in this world? We have to talk about human trafficking, sex trafficking. We have to talk about the children in the Sudan who are in the diamond mines and in the coal mines, getting this minerals to create these iPhones that we enjoy in our society every single day. They're dying of starvation, they're being whipped. Slavery still exists in this world. I have never traveled the world, I've never seen it close down, but I read a lot. But those are two forms of forced labor practice that I know that exist in our society today. Yeah, we talking about fighting for our incarcerated brothers and sisters in the departments of correction around this country, but there is a war for forced labor happening in those countries right in Africa. The Congo, Sudan, Somalia, a lot of forced labor practices are happening right over there. But nobody's not talking about that. I wonder why. I wonder why nobody's not talking about all the ills that are happening on the continent of Africa when it comes to forced labor practices. Is it because the people's skin is black than mine? All I've been hearing in the airwaves is Palestine and Gaza. But they got wars that are happening, forced labor practices, people are being murdered by the millions right there on the continent of Africa, and I have never heard no one in my vicinity discuss Sudan, the Congo, Somalia, not one time. Not one time. And that bothers me. That bothers me every single day. Then I see young girls on Bourbon Street because I have an eye. I can see a woman being sex trafficked. I can see it. I can see her handler pushing her toward the John and her getting in the car. I see it every day. I can identify with it. I just have an eye for things. But yeah, it's definitely happening around the country.
And just by a show of hands, and when I call something out, I want you to raise your hand and keep your hand up. How many in here has a family or relative that's incarcerated or was formerly incarcerated? How many has a friend that was incarcerated or formerly incarcerated? How many of you know someone that's incarcerated? Think about JP. When your family or your friend is incarcerated, guess what? As a free person, you're incarcerated too. $100 to JPay to a family member, they're going to charge you $10.50. You are working on your jobs, trying to pay bills, trying to accommodate things to keep your household going, only for another system to come in and benefit off of our dismay. For someone to benefit off of a system that's been erected to do just what it does, degrade humanity. The funny thing is sometimes is you can sit down and see all this going on, but we don't do anything about it. Join entities like Vote. Join whatever, be a part of. When you have the opportunity to, like Ronald talked about, sex trafficking, there's kids in our neighborhoods that we're not tending to. Think about your neighbor. Think about the kids in your community. Think about the things that you may want in your own life to be manifested in your neighborhood. Let's take back our neighborhoods. Let's not be enslaved to the situations or circumstances that riddles our communities. But more importantly, continue speaking on issues that affect you. Educate yourself on issues that affect you. Because this is a ripple effect that's been going on since Adam and Eve. And at some point in time, people like let me just go ahead and put this down, because I never did use it, y'all. You know, we just have to continue doing what we're doing, coming together and fighting for a cause, but also learning more in-depth details on, once we fight for this cause, what's the underhanded piece that we've been missing or we've been overlooking. We should never stop fighting.
So one, I guess, incident or manifestation of slavery in our current times that I think of that comes to mind immediately are what are called cop cities, which is an issue that we've been partnering with communities on in Atlanta, which is where I live. And cop cities are basically what are dubbed by, the powers that be, public safety training centers, which are really nothing more than militarized training facilities that are going to impact or exact harm on Black and brown and other marginalized communities. And when you think of these cop cities, I can do nothing but think about modern day slavery and brutality that police and law enforcement extract on our brothers and sisters day in and day out. And these sort of buildings, these sort of law enforcement systems that are being funded by private and public dollars are what we don't want in communities, but yet again are put there to control Black and brown bodies, to monitor them, to police them, to extract from them, and to control day in and day out what they are doing. And these facilities are being put right in communities, residential communities, as though they are something that's needed to protect, but we know that they're going to do nothing but, again, exact harm, extract economically, also cause environmental damage on those communities that are literally right next door to these quote unquote police training facilities. So it's something that the communities are fighting, not just in Atlanta, but in Colorado, in Kentucky, and Wisconsin. They're popping up everywhere, but they are once again examples of the state trying to control bodies, Black and brown bodies. And so that's what comes to mind immediately when I think of an answer to your question, Maya.
Thank you all for your answers to this question. As you all talked, you really made me think of how we really live in an extractive economy globally, whether that be through JPay, human trafficking, like voting disenfranchisement, like exploitation of our siblings in Congo, Sudan, Somalia. All of it is interconnected. Also cop cities too. Thank you, Emily. Yeah, really appreciate it. Ronald, I have a question for you directly. So you drafted a new Louisiana law that passed last year called the Mental Healing Justice for Incarcerated People Act. I'm wondering if you can speak to us a bit about your mental health policy advocacy work, and also your work's connection to the movement to end forced labor.
So in prison, when you're in a dormitory with 98 men every day for 25 years, you can identify behavioral patterns. You can see it rampant. It's called transactional analysis. You can study every human being in the dorm and know exactly what they're about to do, how they're about to react, what triggers them, because you're in the dorm with them every day. And I want to understand my own behavior. What caused me to be angry, aggressive, violent, withdrawing? What caused me to be that way? So I began to study everything I could about trauma. And once I got that lens, I began to understand the trauma in the prison. And one inherent quality about trauma is that it's inherently violent. That is trauma at its base. It's angry, it's boisterous, it's mean, it's ugly, and when it reacts, somebody's going to get injured so bad or someone's going to get killed. So when I think about that trauma in myself, I begin to heal. But I also want the men in prison to understand their own childhood trauma and how that childhood trauma carries over into adulthood and how something that happens as a kid, it alters them beyond recognition, and they begin to live in this altered state of being, thinking that that's their original state. No, that's an altered state of trauma. So I began to go inside the prison and jail teaching a trauma curriculum that I created. And I went to Angola for weeks at a time because I wanted these brothers to be better when they walk out of prison. I wanted them to understand the reason why you're behaving the way you're behaving, brother, is because of something happened to you a long time ago and you haven't addressed it yet. So I created this safe space in Angola, and I taught 2 classes on Saturdays, 2 classes on Sundays, 20 men in each class. That's 80 men on a weekend. And I taught at least 4 sets of men for almost 2 years. And the reason why I was so adamant about going into that prison, because eventually these brothers are going to be released into our society. And I would want them to release into our society with that trauma unresolved. Because trauma kills. It hurts. Hurt people hurt people. So the reason why I drafted the Mental Healing Act, I just felt like the Department of Correction wasn't doing enough. They wasn't doing enough. Once you enter the system, it's a makeshift screening, checklist. It's like a conveyor belt. 25 men lined up outside, one go in there, sit down, ask a few questions, he gone, the next one come in. And that is the screening, the mental health screening that you get upon introduction to the prison system. And you do not see the mental health specialist ever again. And the reason why is because in prison, mental health is associated with a stigma or a stereotype. And the Department of Correction impose certain restrictions on you if you are considered a cuckoo bug. So men with serious mental illnesses will avoid the mental health department, so they don't want that label placed on them because they may be trying to go to work release, or they may be trying to go to the police barracks, or they may be trying to become trustee. But if you have a mental health label in your jacket, you cannot qualify for any of those things. So what this bill does a number of things. The Mental Healing Justice Act does a number of things. And I'm going to be calling Natalie soon to see if they start the implementation. But this bill here requires Department of Corrections to screen the entire prison system for post-traumatic stress disorder once a year, every year. The second thing it does, and it was very important for me that this was in the bill, it requires DOC to train both staff and incarcerated men and women in symptoms of PTSD or some of the diagnoses dealing with serious mental illnesses. And the reason why it's important that they're trained in these diagnoses or the symptoms associated with the diagnosis is because so many times a correctional officer will misidentify someone as being defiant when that person was only having a mental health crisis. And you will be dragged out of the dorm, kicked, handcuffed, up the walk, and he's just having a mental health issue, a crisis. But correctional officers don't understand the difference between a mental health crisis and a defiance or someone rebelling. They don't understand it. But if you make a loud, boisterous noise and your behavior is not becoming of what the prison is anointed, you are defiant. And they're going to hit that beeper, and 25 correctional officers, and you have to know this, correctional officers wear racism like a badge of honor. It's almost as if the correctional officers apply for the job so they can execute their racist tendencies upon the men and women in the prisons. You have to know that. They come there for that reason. So many times I've heard correctional officers say, if you keep on playing with me, I'm going to string your ass in that tree. This is coming out the mouth of a professional who is tasked with overseeing and protecting this population, but yet he's hurling threats at the population. But back to the mental health bill. And the mental health bill also requires the Department of Correction to ensure that if someone is receiving medication for any mental health diagnosis, upon their release, they continue to receive that medication. They have to set them up, send them to a mental health outlet, a hospital with an appointment already scheduled, and must also give them a mental health care package with enough medication in that package to ensure that they have medication upon their release so that they can get their treatment. But the mental health bill does a number of things.
Thank you so much. And I really, and I really appreciate how you're making clear that it's important for us to disrupt cycles of trauma because it's how you disrupt violence. Thank you so much. I have a question for Emily. Earlier this year, on May Day, the Center for Constitutional Rights Southern Regional Office filed the case Stanley versus Ivy, seeking to abolish the practice of forced labor and involuntary servitude in all Alabama Department of Corrections facilities. I would love to know what organizations, activists, or movement campaigns influenced you all to pursue this form of legal advocacy.
Sure, thanks for the question, Maya. So this lawsuit, the idea for it was actually brought to us by a coalition of activists and advocates called the Abolish Slavery National Network, which has been mounting campaigns across this country to push state legislatures to eliminate the exception clause or the prison loophole clause in state analogs to the 13th Amendment. So all states pretty much have parallel provisions in their state constitutions, just like the 13th Amendment that allows punishment for quote unquote duly convicted felons. Several states have launched campaigns, successful campaigns, that have eliminated those prison loophole clauses. So they outlaw slavery and voluntary servitude under any and all circumstances, point blank period. Alabama was one of those states. In 2022, voters in Alabama voted to eliminate that prison loophole. And so in Alabama, it is unconstitutional under the state constitution to allow slavery or involuntary servitude within prisons. Nonetheless, of course, those practices continue every day throughout the state of Alabama prisons, in work release facilities and community-based work centers, in private entities like the Wendy's and other restaurants throughout Alabama communities. And in fact, shortly after this prison loophole clause was eliminated from the state constitution, the governor of Alabama issued an executive order 725, that effectively punishes or threatens punishment against incarcerated individuals for refusing to work or even not being able to work. Relatedly, the Alabama Department of Commissioner enacted administrative rules and regulations to uphold that executive order that similarly requires punishment of incarcerated individuals for not working or refusing to work. So the Abolish Slavery National Network came to Center for Constitutional Rights. I think there was an intermediary person in there a couple of years ago saying, hey, we want to bring some teeth to this new constitutional amendment in Alabama. Will you all look into filing a lawsuit? And so we, again, following the leadership of directly impacted people, as my distinguished panelists were talking about earlier, we, took that charge very seriously and did the, research and the outreach on the inside. Number one, find out if this is something that folks on the inside wanted, and if so, how does it relate to other goals of abolition, to other rights and opportunities of justice on the inside and the outside for incarcerated folks and directly impacted people. And so we filed this lawsuit intentionally on May 1st, which is International Workers' Day, because we also view this lawsuit and related efforts within this campaign to abolish forced labor and slavery on the inside as an economic justice issue. It's not just a racial justice issue. There are people, as I've heard, right, Mr. Wynn testify before Congress, there are people who want to work on the inside, and this lawsuit is not intending to get rid of those work programs. I think, as hopefully folks know, that work can be very rehabilitative for folks. They want to have things to do. We've talked with even many of our clients who want to get that training and the certification and the education, so they can be prepared once they are released from prisons to be productive members of society. But the issue is that, as we heard in this documentary, this powerful, powerful documentary that I am still recovering from, that they're not paid a human wage, a fair wage. They're forced to work in inhumane conditions. They are not treated with dignity. Their humanity is not upheld. And so our intent on behalf of our clients and the advocates who brought this idea for the lawsuit to us is to uphold the dignity of incarcerated folks, of organizers on the inside who also mounted a mass strike across the state of Alabama and ADOC prison facilities that were requesting many of these rights and, requesting justice and to request safe conditions and healthy food and, fair wages and health care. That was our intent in bringing this lawsuit, which is just one step along a very, 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 very long journey, right? To seek liberation for folks on the inside and the outside, for Black and brown folks and indigenous people and women and other women of color. This is one manifestation of a much bigger fight. And so, we just got to keep it on, keep the struggle going.
Thank you so much, Emily. And I really love how CCR is exemplifying, in my opinion, movement lawyering of following the leadership of incarcerated workers. And also love the idea of filing on International Workers' Day, drawing connections explicitly to how forced labor needs to be a labor movement issue. So really
Exactly,
appreciate
yeah.
that. Yeah. Okay, so I have a closing question that I'd love if all of you could answer. Can each of you tell us why you do the work that you do, and also what your vision of liberation is?
I do the work that I do because I lost my mom and my dad while I was in prison. And my mom always had a vision of me. My mom always had a dream of me being somebody. And I was taken from my mom at the age of 16. So my mama never saw me again. I never touched me again as a free person. But my mom always knew that I was supposed to have been somebody in life. And so I did all those years in prison against a system that really didn't give me a chance because of my skin color. And that system was didn't show me any humanity. So it's a system that'll just show it to you, they'll laugh at you. And you have to fight that system each and every day, just for human decency. So I do what I do because I'm a human. And regardless of what crime was committed, how much time I've done, I'm a human being. And there are other human beings that's left behind in prison. So I stand for those people. My view of liberation is this. My view of liberation is following in the footsteps of the greats who paved the way for me. People like Nelson Mandela. People like Gabriel Prosser, whom black people don't know about because he wasn't one of the herald heroes in the story of liberation for black people. But people like Malcolm X, being able to come out, pick up the banner, and continue the work that they've done, that's liberation for me. To be able to use my voice for change, and people hear it. People in positions of power hear it, and try to make changes based upon my testimony. That's liberation, and that's liberating also.
I do what I do because as an African American woman that suffered from mental illness dating as early as my teenage years, I learned that education helps, healing helps, and more importantly, for all the women that I left behind, I want them to know that there is hope and that I will not forget about them. And I will join the hands of other incarcerated women and men so that we can continue the legacy and help other women fight. I do what I do because if I don't, who will? One voice counts. Your voice counts.
So there was a time not too long ago when release of someone in Angola was breaking news. And that release happened like 10, 15 years apart. There was a time when vote didn't exist, when PJI didn't exist, when Children's Rights Organization didn't exist. That was a time when we didn't have no representation. I watched the criminal code of procedure of the 1994 do this to that. And all the laws were punitive. Punishments was increased. It was creating new crimes. We were stuck in prison. There was no one representing for us. No one. Mike Foster was governor. Bobby Jindal was governor. It was DBI for most of everybody in the Department of Corrections. The reason why I wake up and do this work every day, because I know what it feels like to be hopeless, to feel that sting of hopelessness every single day, to know that people are advocating against my freedom, that people are advocating for my demise. When you do 25 years in that prison system, you can never forget what that graveyard feels like. It's a sightseeing grave. You actually can see all the people who visit your grave, and some men don't get no visits. They're alive, but they don't get no visits. Prison is a sightseeing grave. And the reason I go in that office every single day, because I have an opportunity to fight back. I'm a first responder in this work. If I don't do it, Terrence don't do it, Emily don't do it, D don't do it, it don't get done. If Vote don't do it, it don't get done. If I don't go to work, I'm giving up on my people. I can't ever give up on them. People wonder why I come to the office with my soul heavy, because our experiences are different. They're different. They haven't been where we've been at. I haven't seen what we've seen. I don't do this work with smiles on my face. I can't. My soul is still traumatized, never healed, and I doubt if it will ever heal. And my idea of liberation is when formerly incarcerated men and women are a protected class, like black people, like people with disabilities, like people 40+ years of age, like veterans. Those are protected classes. I can't go nowhere in this country without running into a barrier because of my conviction history. So what liberation looked like for me, until I and everybody like me, formerly incarcerated men and women, are protected from discrimination in this society. That's what true liberation looked like for me.
I find it hard to follow Ronald on that one. But why do I do this work? I went to law school knowing I wasn't going to ever work for the man. I went to law school because I knew that all of our liberation is intertwined with one another. I didn't do it with any sort of intent, right, to save the world, which is so cliche, and that's not what we're here for. We're here to work together because, yeah, all of our destiny, our future, our liberation depends on one another. And it is really my belief that if you don't use your law degree or whatever training, whatever background, whatever experience you have towards this goal of liberation, it is a waste. And so I try to talk to as many law students as I can possibly connect with about using the degree for public interest, or what, it doesn't have to be practicing law, but it has to be something in service of community, of your community. And that's what I'm fully committed to. I also do this work because of folks like Deidre and Terrence and Ronald, who are so inspiring and whose leadership I want to follow and whose work I want to inform our work at CCR. We can't do it without the work of you all. So thank you. What does liberation look like for me? The first thing that comes to mind when I hear that question is love. I think it's also this, and being in community and being able to come together and mounting these powerful campaigns and just building a foundation of fellowship so we can build that trust and do this work together. And again, once again, it is following the leadership of directly impacted people and working alongside them. What can we do at organizations like CCR and PJI and Vote to really flank these campaigns and these movements with whatever resources are necessary in terms of legal advice, cultural work like films, screening films like these to educate the public, trainings, to give, that support that folks need to do their thing and self-govern and determine what liberation looks like for themselves. It's not for me to determine, it's not for any of us to determine, it's for us to collectively determine together and really work together towards that collective vision.
Thank you all so much for your brilliance, your expertise, your words. Really appreciated just listening and being in y'all's presence. I have no idea what time it is, but I do hope that we have time for a Q&A, at least a couple of questions. Anybody?
I got a question. Yeah,
Chuck, I really enjoyed the. First of all, I just want to say I really enjoyed the documentary. But the one thing I quarrel with somewhat is that Professor Armstrong, who I know is very esteemed and she's brilliant, but when she talked about the exception to the 13th Amendment, she basically said, well, the Constitution says one thing, but the way she described it here is if like maybe the courts are interpreting it in a different way. And based on my own research, I'm not so sure that that's the truth. I think that the exception in the 13th Amendment has done exactly what it was intended to do from the very beginning. But if there's something that Professor Armstrong or someone else understands that I don't understand, and maybe it's not the Constitution, it's just the interpretation, I would like somebody to give me some clarity on that.
Yeah, I appreciate your question. So when Professor Armstrong was speaking now, she didn't specifically identify the 13th Amendment as operating different from freedom in prison. She was saying that courts interpret that Constitution differently for people's society as it do for us who are incarcerated. The Constitution is always interpreted against us in prison, all the time. But in society, someone brings a similar claim, and you have to read the precedents, the cases, to really see what Professor Armstrong has seen reading that black and white. I've seen it reading the law. In society, it's a different interpretation. But come to imprisonment, it's a totally different thing slammed against us. And that's what she was talking about.
But the problem is that there were, can I say one thing? There were some radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner who were there in the beginning to help, construct the 13th Amendment. And they fought a good battle, right? But I'm saying the forces who were opposing them, that at the end, that brother did say it was a compromise. And in my estimation, I think that's more accurate. It was, in the end, it was just a compromise and did exactly what it was intended to do. And it's not like just the court somewhere just misinterpreting what the framers of that amendment intended.
We'll give you a little context real quick. I appreciate that. And if you ever get it, go get it. It's called 500 Years of Imprisonment. Get that book. In that book, there is a context that's not talked about in mainstream publications. So there were 5 senators, representatives during the 1800s. They opposed slavery. Everything about slavery, they opposed it. They hated slavery. It was abolitionists, true and true. But one of them had a very good friend, Representative Henderson. He was the head proposer of the 13th Amendment. He had a good friend who was a wealthy slave owner. Now think about this. You got 5 men who co-sponsored the 13th Amendment, and all of them were abolitionists. They hated the word slavery. But one of them had a wealthy best friend who owned almost 10,000 slaves. And he told his best friend, you have to give me that exception. And soon they put that exception in there. The same year was ratified. That same slave owner became a representative of the United States, and he proposed the black codes. I'm talking about they was enacted at the same time, the same year. Read the book, 500 Years of Imprisonment. It lays out the conspiracy about that exception and why it was in there. Think about it. 5 abolitionists who hate slavery now give an exception to slavery. That was the underhanded dealing going on that society's not was aware of. But if you dig in them history books like we did in that prison, you can see that that was a favor. That was some bad, and they still do it today. They still do it on Capitol Hill. Underhanded back dealing, they still do it right now today. I'm gonna give you the bill, but I need to put that in there for it to ride.
I think we have time for one more question. Oh, we have no time. Oh, actually, so sorry, y'all. Thank you so much for coming.